So, my friends, I didn't want to dive into this stuff, but I guess at some point you have to. You have to rise to the quality of the evidence, and you have to rise to the responsibility of your knowledge when you know something is happening and going on. And, I think we all have social and moral obligations when certain issues happen. And I feel strongly that good psychics are essentially kind of very precious commodities. I think, of course, we're all psychic, but they've proven in study after study that there are some people with extra little bit of mojo. And they've proven this in studies around the world, from China, Russia, here in the US, conclusively, from private to government studies. Many different research efforts have proven this. So, it used to be when you investigated UFOs 50 years ago, when the government wanted to keep that information secret, it was dangerous for people. But now we need to release the UFO evidence. The government realizes the dire straits that we're in, and that we must release this evidence, and that the events are happening at such a rate and at such a high fidelity that the government cannot be suppressing any further, and that humanity needs to know about these things for a bunch of obvious logical reasons. But now, what used to happen with UFOs, this suppression of the evidence, has been happening with essentially psi, the powers of the mind. The evidence has been suppressed for many decades, and information has come out through the tenacious work of investigators who've done FOIAs, and you can go to the CIA's reading room and see some very, very interesting documents. And you can do some research and find out the NSA, the CIA, all the branches of the government have utilized psychics, the millions and millions and millions of dollars, by my calculation and estimation, well over 200 million at least. So I wanted to show you some of the facts of how much the government not only believes in these powers of the mind and how much they've fully accepted all of the science, but how much the government and militaries and intelligence agencies and people who care perceive this ability as a threat. And so let's dive in right now, gang, and I want to share a screen with you and show you just a little tiny peek at some of this information, shall we? Now, there are tons and tons and tons of documents and tons of studies that have been done on the mind and plants and everything from just so many different types of studies that have proven the powers of psychokinesis, the ability to move matter, and precognition and retrocognition, and many other things. So a lot of these documents have interesting things in them, like there was a briefing to the NSA director saying that, yes, ESP is real. There's a breakdown for some of the potential strategies and things they could do with this stuff. There are documents that, here, we're going to dive into a couple of these real quick. Let's just dive into the CIA, the ESP threats one over here. This is a written document from one of the directors, and it says across the top, this is from the NSA, ESP research has its dangers. The possibility of the psychic the personality of the psychic often becomes unbalanced. He is difficult. So that's a danger. 2, the telepathic phenomena associated with ESP can be destructive of equipment, especially electronic equipment. Since it's fading, it's very hard to read, but that clairvoyance could be dangerous, and ESP leads to other things. And so there's quite a few of these really kind of scary documents that say that it's a threat, it's dangerous. The Russians have advanced to this startling level, or the Chinese have advanced to this startling level. And they've made really fascinating discoveries. One of the discoveries in the document over here is that psychokinesis, like in random number generators, doesn't just affect the matter, but it also affects the total statistical curve. Because if there's a really high peak in the numbers in a meta-analysis, there will also be a corresponding negative dip in the meta-analysis. So something is affecting the whole greater statistical curve and not just the physical matter. That was one of the conclusions of these. So many of these, here's one. I want to go down to this other one that says RB guidelines and threats. And there's another threat assessment one too I want to go over with you guys. So here's a top one that was once top secret. Notes on the National Security Agency's ESP concerns and guidelines. This is their concerns and guidelines. The nature and vulnerability of targets and communication should be tested and the degree of weakness determined. The number of NSA persons with operating ESP capabilities should be isolated by type and quality. All of the different types of ESP skills are explored. Third, gifted people should be isolated and tested and categorized and tested against ComSec systems. Any person with telekinetic capabilities or problems should be isolated and studied to determine all these different factors. A cadre, number 5, this one is very fascinating. A cadre of talented, synergized, gifted people should be formed for special problem-solving tests. It kind of sounds like what we already have going, gang, with our, quote, secret research project that's going to come out in the open soon. A number of high-grade talented, where am I? Oh. Psychics of various types should be isolated by their type and individual names and locations listed, especially in the US, Europe, China, and Soviet Union bloc countries. So they basically want a list of all the high-grade talented people. They want to know where the fuck they are and what the fuck they're doing. And that's a little scary to me. I just want everyone to know that I'm not talented and I'm not gifted and I'm not high-grade. Anyway, let's just take a look at a couple more of these. I mean, there's a bunch of these reports that I have. This was the threat to ComStat. This was a different one. You can get a lot of these at the CIA reading room. Here's a confidential draft. Extrasensory perception, general thoughts about it, the relationship, how it works. This paper was really interesting because it talked about some experiments that were done with shrimp dying next to plants and that the plants detected it. Very, very fascinating. Really, 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 really fascinating. Maybe I can see if I can find that part right here. Where is it? But they just really, really, really fascinating stuff. And basically what they ended up discovering is that there's like a field or something, a life field. That's what they presumed here, about Russia's deep involvement and some experiments and thoughts that they had. There's a lot of really interesting stuff. Here's another threat assessment about ESP. Extrasensory perception and telekinesis, a ComSec threat. Here's a briefing. I mean, this is pretty serious. Let's go down to the conclusions of this one, which I think is pretty important. This is a briefing that was made, and it talked about targets and how well they did and the things that they did, the states of consciousness. They got into some of the philosophy behind it, how this traces all the way back into even stuff like the Kabbalah. Really fascinating document. And then at the end, they basically say that it's, definitely real. They've done all these experiments, who, what, when, where, why, how. It's really, really pretty stunning. So, I mean, they say time and time again, they go through the experiments and the conclusions, and yes, it's real, it happened. It's pretty crazy. So this is not just proving the validity of ESP, but also significantly psychokinesis. And these are all different assessments. These are all different groups and organizations coming in and assessing and looking at these cases, reviewing them after the research has been done. So very fascinating stuff. It's pretty intense. There's a couple more documents I want to show you really quickly because I think this is important. Ingo Swann did some work with, I believe it was Hal Puthoff, and it was on plants. And he also did some work with Dean Radin. I think, was this one Dean Radin and Ed May? I forget, but it's definitely with Ed May. Anyway, Ingo, of course, performed off the charts, incredible. His performance was really reviewed deeply and intensely, and the statistics behind it and everything. And of course, he was off the charts, way above statistical norms. And the CIA was very interested in him and his work. There's quite a few documents and reports, scientific conclusions of things that Ingo Swann did that the CIA wanted full documentation on and wanted all the information on. Fascinating thing here on psychotronics. Really fascinating thing on psychotronics. Affecting machines, machines' interactions with psychic abilities, all sorts of different aspects of this. This is a thing with Hal Puthoff, with Russell Targ. This is really interesting too. They had a couple really interesting experiments where they had rats in these different cages. And they found out that if you put the rats together as like a group and then you separate them into two groups and you put them in two different places, if you hurt these rats will have a little bit of a detectable effect. So there's like this biofield, this morphogenic kind of field. Tons of stuff from that conference and things associated with psychotronics. Fascinating aspect of psychic abilities and ESP is psychotronics. And then finally, this is a fascinating one really quickly. US scientists went to Russia to go review some of their best psychics and experiments and came back and was debriefed and everything. And he had stunning observations he saw. Finally, we're going to take a little look at this document. If you still don't believe that the government believes in these abilities and is worried about them, then you need to look at this document. Now, this is slide 9. Excuse me, pardon me. I know it must be annoying with my all my allergies and my medicine making my throat dry and everything. But anyway, I hope you can plow through with me because this stuff is really incredibly important. So remember, this is slide 9 from the Chris Mellon leak. That was the congressional briefing, okay? So this is a congressional briefing based on all of the information that ATIP learned. And ATIP got all of its information from military cases. These are really high-grade evidentiary value cases with incredibly high fidelity evidence, video, infrared, multiple witnesses, radar, multiple radar, all of these different things. All of these incidents were reviewed by top scientists and all sorts of different types of scientists and different research groups even. And after they've culled all that information from all of those cases, They determined the biggest threats to the United States based on their observations of those best cases. Okay, so that's very important to realize the background of the quality of the information and the quality of the research, and also the high level that this information is being used for as a congressional briefing. Okay, so the DOD feared these things. Just, I know we've spoken about this before, like several months ago on a couple videos, but it really bears repeating now. The scenario exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate U.S. facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security. Psychotronic weapons, cognitive human interface, penetration of solid surfaces, instantaneous sensor disassembly, alteration, manipulation of a biological organism, anomalies in the space-time construct, unique cognitive human interface experiences. And of course, the Department of Defense, after reviewing all that information and coming to the conclusion about those vulnerabilities, felt compelled to mention the advantages the Department of Defense holds in the investigation of this phenomenon. So the advantages that they hold in the investigation of these vulnerabilities is that the DoD has been involved in experiments in the past, and we have just seen some of the results of those experiments. The DoD has relationships with renowned subject matter experts. So of course, they've been working with the experts in these many fields associated. And then finally, the Department of Defense controls several facilities where activities have been detected. So we know there are locations of repeat phenomena occurrence. Malmstrom Air Force Base has been repeated numerous times. And it's not just the nuclear sites that have repeat occurrences. There are several locations that the Department of Defense or the Defense Intelligence Agency controls that has repeat occurrences. And other locations that actually are not associated with the Department of Defense. They just have recognized numerous repeat craft sightings there. One I can mention is near Catalina Island. So anyway, gang, these are all powers of the mind. These don't have to be the greatest threats. And although these are perceived as threats from these advanced civilizations, these are also abilities humans have. We all have. We have to come to terms with a lot of this stuff. We have to accept the responsibility for the fact that we live in an interactive reality and that people can change the reality itself. The consequences of this are incredibly dynamic if you really think about it. And there are defenses against these things, although a lot of the research by the government says that there's not, but there are. And there's other things that can be done. But essentially, this is all about transparency, power to the people, and that we all have to rise to a new level of responsibility. We have to watch over our brother and sister and care about each other and take responsibility for the power of our thoughts. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you think psychics are a threat? Talented telekinetics are a threat? Do you think this is all bullshit and disinformation? What do you think someone who is talented with these abilities should do? Should they just hide? I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Much love.